I've got a crazy idea for you to think about that I've slightly ripped off and modified to simplify and make a little more interesting, in my opinion. What if the modern BBC show called Sherlock, which sets Sherlock Holmes in modern day London, and the CBS show Elementary, which sets Sherlock Holmes in modern day New York, take place in the same universe and take place in the same continuity as the original Arthur Conan Doyle Sherlock Holmes stories set in the Victorian era? Well, what evidence is there that these shows could take place in the same continuity as the original Sherlock Holmes stories? Well, Sherlock had a whole episode set in the Victorian era of Holmes solving a crime in his original context of 1895 or whenever. Now, that was all posed as just, oh, this is the modern Sherlock, imagining what he would have been like back then. What if that's not true? What if that really is the story that happened? What if both of those stories are true? And there's an even stronger case with Elementary. There is an interesting line in one of the official novels of the Elementary TV series. The blue carbuncle is a gem that shows up, and Holmes says that this gem has a long and storied history, including once being hidden in a goose. That is, of course, what happens in the story, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, the Sherlock Holmes story by Arthur Conan Doyle. That suggests that that story and the new Elementary show are in the same continuity, right? How does that work? So, you may have heard of a movie called They Might Be Giants, starring George C. Scott, as a guy who suffers a head injury and wakes up thinking he's Sherlock Holmes. He's paired with a female psychiatrist named Dr. Watson, because that's how that goes. The law of comedy dictates it. Now, what can we kind of infer from that? Well, we could see that there's something that happens to some people whereby they actually start thinking that they're Sherlock Holmes. What it seems like is that George C. Scott's character in that movie is a victim of Great Detective Syndrome, which was a term coined by a researcher named Jess Nevins a long time ago. Great Detective Syndrome is not too complicated to explain. It's basically a syndrome whereby somebody becomes so fascinated by the character of Sherlock Holmes, immerses themselves so thoroughly in Sherlock Holmes and perhaps even studied under him, that they begin to adapt traits of his personality, start actually conforming their own personality to his personality, and in extreme cases actually mistake themselves for him. Now, we actually have something sort of like this in real life, assuming Great Detective Syndrome does not also exist in real life. If you spent enough time around Sherlock Holmes fans, you might change your mind. There's something called Jerusalem Syndrome, whereby somebody might go to Jerusalem or some other holy site, and they're so affected by it that they start getting the idea that they have a divine call or commission, or some kind of mission. Like they start thinking of themselves as a mystic. Some of us think it's actually possible that God can speak to you in these holy places, but it's also a syndrome whereby there's something about how important and beautiful and sacred these places are that kind of gets into people's minds and convinces them that they have some special connection to it. And it seems like there may be something like that with Sherlock Holmes, and They Might Be Giants depicts an example of it. Now, the reason this theory is so helpful to us is that it explains a whole lot of other characters who are named Sherlock Holmes. In the wake of the end of the Sherlock Holmes stories, in fact, even earlier than that, when it was thought that Sherlock Holmes was dead, there were a whole lot of fiction writers who were trying to write their own Sherlock Holmes stories. And Arthur Conan Doyle usually didn't sanction that. Which is why you'll have a character like Holmlock Shears going up against Arsène Lupin. Now, sometimes these characters actually called themselves Sherlock Holmes. Sometimes they were just very, very similar to Sherlock Holmes. Now, if Great Detective Syndrome is real, then all of these people can actually be explained away as being sufferers of Great Detective Syndrome. So what would be some examples? Well, one would be Sexton Blake, who was often called the poor man's Sherlock Holmes. He even lived at 221B Baker Street. He had so many characteristics in common with Sherlock Holmes, he was basically a way for people to write Sherlock Holmes stories without getting Arthur Conan Doyle breathing down their necks. Auguste Derleth, who had politely asked Arthur Conan Doyle for permission to write Holmes stories and was equally politely declined, created the character of Solar Pons, who goes around with his partner, Dr. Parker, to solve crimes. And he is like a Holmes clone, basically. In French comics, there was the character of Harry Dixon, who was called the American Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, I don't know why the French comic book writers didn't situate their Holmes character in France, or even in England. They well, let's we want to rip off Sherlock Holmes, but we don't want to make him too similar. What's going to appeal most to the French? Let's put him in the States? I don't know, whatever. But anyways, he was the American Sherlock Holmes. He is in French stories and fiction. Fu Manchu's great opponent is Sir Dennis Nayland Smith, who goes around with his partner, Dr. Petrie. He's also sort of this arch detective who smokes a pipe. He's physically very similar to Sherlock Holmes. All of these guys we can explain as being people who've suffered great detective syndrome. And it's not just limited to humans either. I mean, what do you think happened to Basil of Baker Street? It goes even further. It may even be that Holmes himself is suffering from a kind of great detective syndrome. Umberto Eco's novel The Name of the Rose, set in the 14th century, and it depicts a Franciscan friar named William of Baskerville solving a series of deaths at a monastery. As the name William of Baskerville should imply, he's something of a tribute to Sherlock Holmes, and he has a lot of characteristics in common with Sherlock Holmes. But of course he predates Holmes by several hundred years. Now, if Holmes went to the same school Arthur Conan Doyle did, which was the Jesuit school, Stonyhurst, it's possible the Jesuits there introduced him to the records Otto von Milk wrote down about William of Baskerville. He was entranced with this character of William of Baskerville, and then he actually took on the personality of William of Baskerville. So even Holmes himself would actually be a patient, a sufferer of great detective syndrome. And this theory is strengthened by the fact that there are some Japanese characters who are set during the shogunate. They're set prior to Sherlock Holmes, but after William of Baskerville, who seem like very Holmesian. And again, that would make sense if the Jesuits had brought these records of William of Baskerville to Japan. That would account for how these Japanese characters could have great detective syndrome, because they're mimicking William of Baskerville. What makes this theory even more plausible is if you look at the Basil Rathbone Sherlock Holmes movies. Now, the first two are set in Victorian England, but all the other ones are set in World War II, when the films were made. Now, Holmes obviously was not a young man during World War II. Seems unlikely that he and Watson were out having these adventures at this time. So, what's going on? Well, it could be that these characters are actually Solar Pons and Dr. Parker having adventures. But when Universal got the rights to make their stories into movies, they thought, well, no one's really heard of Solar Pons. Let's call him Sherlock Holmes. That'll be a lot more marketable. And hey, we'll even use these actors who played Holmes and Watson in our previous films to play them. And that would also explain why Moriarty shows up a bunch of times in the Basil Rathbone movies. Never once the same actor. There's no continuity between them in that sense. Which would make a lot of sense if these are all different villains that he's fighting, but the movies just call him Moriarty because he's just fighting this guy. He's just call him Moriarty. I mean, Rathbone's Holmes is not the only one who's set in what was then modern day. Raymond Massey's Holmes in the 1931 Speckled Band has a huge computer that he uses, so that's not the Holmes of the original story either. It must be another guy who has great detective syndrome. Now, after about the 40s, you don't find as many fiction authors using Sherlock Holmes-like characters or writing their own characters named Sherlock Holmes. And I think it's because after World War II, it was becoming obvious that you can't be Sherlock Holmes because Holmes is like from the Victorian era. By now, he'd be very, very elderly. So it seems to me that cases of great detective syndrome after that veer more in the direction of just adapting traits of Holmes. Although I do think there can be some examples of people who didn't think they were Holmes, but might have thought that they were descended from Holmes. So, for example, Creighton Holmes in The Adventures of Creighton Holmes. The character Arthur Sherlock Holmes in The Strange Case of the End of Civilization as We Know It. Both Creighton and Arthur Holmes claim to be the grandson of Sherlock Holmes. The character of Abraham Moth, who is rumored to be the son of Sherlock Holmes in the graphic novel called, Son of Sherlock Holmes. I am not a believer in the idea that Holmes has any children, or, was ever in a situation to have produced any children. So I think it's much more likely that these people who say, or are rumored to be descendants of Sherlock Holmes, are actually people who had a kind of great detective syndrome. They knew they couldn't actually be Holmes, but they thought they must have some connection to him. The exception would be a very extreme case like George C. Scott's in They Might Be Giants. And it should be noted that great detective syndrome does not only affect people who actually are great detectives, because the character who calls himself Arthur Sherlock Holmes is a pretty incompetent detective. But it might go even further than that. In 1987 and 1993, there were two TV movies with very similar titles, Sherlock Holmes Returns and The Return of Sherlock Holmes. Both of them were about Sherlock Holmes, who has been cryogenically frozen, being resuscitated in modern day, the modernity of the early 90s and late 80s. And in the 87 one, he even meets a lady named Watson. It's wacky. Maybe more plausible, I'd say, is that both of these characters are people who suffered from Great Detective Syndrome. For both of those guys, they came up with the explanation that they were cryogenically frozen to kind of explain how they can be so young and still be Sherlock Holmes in the 90s and late 80s. Now look again at the Solar Ponds example of the Basil Rathbone movies that I think are actually about solar ponds. Right. This shows that a lot of these adaptations of these characters would alter things so that the character actually would be Sherlock Holmes. That way, it's more marketable, right? So I think those two TV movies could be about cases of people who had Great Detective Syndrome that decided to run with it and say, yeah, these guys really were Sherlock Holmes. Watch our movie on 8 p.m. Thursday evening. So this brings us to the modern adaptations of Sherlock and Elementary. These two guys could also be characters who think that they're Sherlock Holmes. In fact, we have another example of somebody who might have Great Detective Syndrome, and that's Gregory House, right, who has a whole lot in common with Sherlock Holmes. And he's not a detective, but he clearly shares enough in common with Holmes that it's plausible that he also suffers from this ailment, if you want to call it that. So it could very well be, to me, that the two guys on Elementary and on Sherlock are also dudes who have Great Detective Syndrome. And the TV adaptations honor them by calling them Sherlock, again, so their shows will sell better. They couldn't do that with House, because House isn't a detective, right? But if they could have, they probably would have changed his name to Holmes as well. But these two guys are detectives, so rather than having their real names on the show, they just call them Sherlock Holmes. There are also comics depicting Holmes and Watson as African-American investigators in modern-day Harlem. Presumably these are also guys who are afflicted with Great Detective Syndrome. And like Holmes, they're going to deliberately seek out doctors to work with, maybe even doctors named Dr. Watson, because remember in They Might Be Giants, the psychiatrist who's paired with him is named Dr. Watson. And moreover, yes, a lot of the cases have some similarities to the original stories, but they're not the only ones who were inspired by the original stories. The villains can also be inspired by the original stories. There's probably a lot of villains who have studied Professor Moriarty and based their tactics on Professor Moriarty. So it's very plausible. Maybe they even use Moriarty as an alias. That's not impossible at all. Therefore, I think it's possible, it's reasonable, and it's fun to kind of think that all of these different Sherlock Holmes characters are actually all people suffering from this syndrome. And that way they can actually be in continuity with each other and can actually be in continuity with the original Sherlock Holmes, who's sort of like Batman, right? Batman has this like Bat family, right? People who can carry on the Batman mythos. Holmes has kind of inadvertently created that too. Unless you think Holmes actually is training some of these guys, which, I mean, that's an interesting theory. Maybe Holmes is training some of these guys. It may be also that this syndrome afflicts people who are similarly situated to Holmes. For example, younger brothers of smart older guys. Obviously, a lot of these guys have a kind of Mycroft figure, like a smart older brother, who's often very different, though, than the Mycroft is written, right? The Mycrofts from the Elementary and Sherlock are not really very similar to the original Mycroft Holmes of the story. Other people might have even theorized that some of these guys kind of pick people to be their Mycroft. So Solar Ponds has an older brother named Bancroft. Some have theorized that that's actually not his older brother. It's the character John Dixon Carr created called Sir Henry Merivale, who's a very similar figure. He's like a big fat government worker. He's also a member of the Diogenes Club. And maybe he befriended Solar Ponds and he just calls him Bancroft. He just he treats him like his Mycroft, right? So they don't even have to literally even be brothers. What do you think? Leave a comment. Take care.